Hi, I'm Sarah Muller.
And I'm Renee McFarlane.
This is a presentation about how funding works for ordinary public schools in South Africa. Our main aim in making these videos was to construct an overview for a lay audience on how budgets for schools work. We presented this information to the Education Fishtank in March of 2017. Education Fishtank is a public education forum that seeks to disseminate expert knowledge about education issues in South Africa to the general public. Some of the material presented here comes from a master's level course on education policy at the University of Cape Town. Other parts of the material were researched in the process of examining the education budget by Renee in her capacity as a researcher at Equal Education. Thanks to both institutions for the support to do this work.
The information here is only about basic education, that is primary and secondary schooling in ordinary schools in South Africa. And hence, it does not cover special needs schools and private schooling. It also does not cover tertiary education, that is, universities and TVET colleges. The information presented here was sourced in February 2017, so some legislation and numbers may have changed between the time this presentation was made and when you watch it.
There are 3 videos in the series. Please feel free to distribute them to interested people. For more information about our other Fish Tank sessions, you can find us on Facebook at Education Fishtank or on Twitter at EduFishtank.
The 3 guiding questions we're going to focus on in this presentation are: 1. How much money is there to spend on basic education? 2. What does this money get spent on? For example, how much goes to building new school buildings, paying teachers, buying textbooks, etc.? And 3. Who gets to spend this money? Is it the national department, the provincial department, principals, or school governing bodies? We're going to explore the answers to these as we move through the video.
It's also useful while we move through the presentation to think about what it is that we want from our education system. There are 3 ideas that are helpful to frame this: equality, equity, and adequacy. Equality is about the system treating everyone the same. That is, we spend the same on each child, in the same way, for the same things. This idea has a lot of traction in South Africa because under apartheid, education spending was extremely unequal. Equity is about the system trying to reduce inequalities. It's also sometimes called positive discrimination. Equity issues hang on the idea of social justice, recognizing that treating people as equal when some are disadvantaged and others have privileges is not necessarily fair. Adequacy is about the question about what is enough. It makes us think about what we hope to provide for each child in our schools and what we need to commit in order to achieve this. Notice that the first 2 ideas, equality and equity, are about comparing 2 or more different groups of people and how they are treated. But adequacy doesn't need a comparison. The idea of enough can be applied to each child, even if the answer to the question, what is enough to educate this child, is subtly different in every case. We hope this video shows that there are contradictions and tensions between the ideas of equality and equity in South African schools, particularly around money and budgets. This is deeply rooted in our history and apartheid's lingering effects.
With these in mind, it's interesting to think about the statement made by the then Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan, in his budget speech in Parliament in February 2016. He said, "The budget rests on the idea of an inclusive social contract, encompassing an equitable burden of tax and a progressive program of expenditures." This statement clearly makes references to notions of equity, redressing inequalities through progressive spending on those who need it most. Let's see if this is what actually happens with the money that Treasury sets aside for schools.
In this, our first video, we're going to start at the big picture level, the national budget. We've called this the macro level. The main documents and policies that matter at this level are the national budget, produced every year by the Treasury, the South African Constitution, and the South African Schools Act, or SASSA.
In the second video, we move down to the provincial level, showing how the money that comes from the National Revenue Fund is divided between provinces and how this division is decided. We'll also look at what provinces can do with the money that they get by looking at the equitable share formula, as well as the national norms and standards for school funding, also known as the NNSSF.
And finally, in the last video, we'll look at the micro level, examining how much money actually arrives in a school's bank account, where it comes from, what can be done with it, and what constraints are in place for getting it and spending it. Okay, we're starting at national. How big is the pie? How much money is there for basic education? The total national non-interest expenditure presented in February of 2017 was a total of 1.24 trillion rand. Non-interest expenditure is what we have left over to spend once we have serviced our national debts. As an aside, this is part of why junk status matters so much. When ratings agencies downgrade a country, the interest rate charged on national debt goes up. That means more money to service the same debt levels as before, meaning less money left over for non-interest expenditure afterwards. Junk status has a real effect on our national budget for things like hospitals, schools, and roads. The amount of that 1.24 trillion rand set aside for basic education is 218 billion rand, or about 18%. Remember that the basic education and higher education departments were separated in 2009. This 18% increase is an increase from last year, when basic education only had 13.95% of the budget. But it's also useful to remember that this shift in percentage does not necessarily mean more money in real terms. If the total budget has gone down and school spending stays the same, then the percentage goes up, but this doesn't mean more rands going to schools. We must also adjust for inflation, remembering that what a rand bought last year is not the same as what a rand will buy this year. Overall, education as a percentage of the national budget has been declining for the last 6 years and only lifted again in this latest budget in 2017. This brings us to an interesting point. In South Africa, we often like to quote the idea that we spend more than most countries on our schools. It's worth taking some time to unpack this. Most of the time, the phrase about South African education expenditure refers to how much of our GDP is spent on education. South Africa allegedly spends more on education as a percent of GDP than other countries. But there are a few problems with this. Firstly, GDP, or gross domestic product, and national expenditure are related, but they are not the same. GDP refers to how much our economy makes. How much our economy makes does not directly translate into the government's budget. Also, expenditure refers to how much we spend on things. Obviously, we try to keep expenditure close to or under our budget, because if it's more, we have to borrow the difference. But we can see that there are two connections that are being hidden here. Firstly, gross domestic product does not equal budget. And secondly, budget does not always equal expenditure. The other problem is that GDP is an absolute measure, not a relative one. That is, we can know how much our economy makes, but it doesn't tell us how many people are involved in that economy. A gross domestic product produced by 5 million people is a very different prospect to that same gross domestic product produced by 50 million people. That is, GDP gives you an approximation of how much pie you might have, as economic productivity turns into a budget through taxes. But it doesn't tell you how many mouths you have to feed with it. A small improvement on our comparison might be made by thinking about GDP per person or per capita. This at least takes into account population size. For example, in 2013, the South African GDP per capita was 6,617 US dollars. Let's compare this to some other nation states. In the same year, the USA's GDP was just over 53,000 US dollars per person. The United Kingdom's was just under 42,000 USD. India was about 1,500 USD. China was about 6,800. And Australia was just over 56,000 US dollars per person. We can see that China's amount is the most comparable to ours. Imagine how that information is lost when we quote total GDP. China's total economy is huge and dwarfs South Africa's. But of course China also has the largest population in the world. Even still, this fails to capture how much of GDP actually becomes accessible for spending by the government. This also depends on how much debt the government is in, as well as what their tax rates are, and how efficient they are at collecting those taxes. But we can see that even if tax rates were different and collection rates varied, there is still an enormous difference between the amount of money to spend on a child in a school in Australia compared to a child in a school in South Africa. We need to keep this in mind when we compare schooling outcomes. Here's an interesting comparison that exposes some of the pitfalls we're talking about here. In 2016 and 2017, California's education budget was about 71 billion US dollars. This was in current exchange terms about 1 trillion rand. In 2016-2017, South Africa's entire education budget for the whole country was 204 billion, about 20% of California's. South Africa's population is about 50 million people. California's is 38 million. But we can see in these two population pyramids, which haven't changed drastically, that a large percentage of our population is of school-going age compared to the percentage of California's. That is, we have more children to support with our budget. So while we might spend more of our budget on education than other countries, it's prudent to remember our budget is not really big compared to the number of people it must support. So GDP per capita doesn't tell us how many of our population are school-going age. If we make the simplifying assumption about GDP per capita, we still need to think about who we spend it on. For example, a country with an aging population, like England or Japan, will spend more on healthcare than on schooling. A country with a younger population will probably need to spend a greater percentage on schools. A developing country may need to spend more on infrastructural development than a country where all the roads only need maintaining rather than rebuilding. Comparing percentages of GDPs across countries is a very crude way of reasoning about whether we're spending too much or too little on schools, or anything else for that matter. Even then, overall, South Africa spends close to the international average on basic education. We invite you to follow the link here to see what other countries spend and their trends in spending, whether it is going up or down. Developing countries tend to spend more as they have younger populations. But look at the site and play around with some of the numbers, and then decide for yourself. Okay, we've established we need to think a little more carefully about the numbers we're about to see. They might seem big. Truthfully, it's quite hard for us to relate to these amounts of money, as most of us have no experience of working with these volumes in our everyday lives. But hopefully the last few slides have given us a sense that just because the numbers are big, and some people like to say they are too big, that the situation is a little bit more complicated. In 2017, there just are under 13 million learners enrolled in public schools from grades 1 to 12. These learners attend about 25,500 public schools. That's a lot of schools. And we have about 418,000 teachers officially employed by the state. This doesn't include teachers employed from school fees by school governing bodies. But we'll talk about that a little bit later when we look at individual schools' budgets. All these learners, schools and teachers are distributed across 86 districts in 9 provinces. Let's take a look at some of these large numbers and think about what they mean. If we do some rounding and assume about 13 million learners, our budget nationally for the year gives us about 16,769 Rand a learner. This must cover everything: teacher salaries, photocopied worksheets, textbooks, desks, electricity, water, the school van, the curriculum advisor, the school building, the sports equipment, etc. We're going to come back to this figure in the next episodes when we have more information to use to judge whether it's adequate or not. For now, we're going to see in the next video how the money from the national budget trickles down through the provinces and how it is distributed at that level.